So my name's Alex Kosowski, and I work for Oracle. I'm on the Oracle WebLogic security team, and I'm here to present to you work I've been doing for the last year about JSR 375. It's a new JSR that we're creating for EE security. You can see that Duke's looking kind of old. That's kind of like the state of the EE security platform right now in terms of its cross-platform. It's general standardization at this point. So I'm going to talk to you about this new JSR we put together recently. So I have to start out, this is a typical Oracle kind of thing. I have to start out by just informing you all that this is only for informational purposes. Don't start any businesses or any type of, make any business decisions based on what I'm telling you. This is really just for your information. So today I'm going to talk to you about the motivations behind the new JSR. I'm going to give you a little of insight into the process that's gone on behind the scenes with the JSR. Most of the presentation we spend talking about ideas, really the ideas that the expert group has come up with. We have a team of 14 experts. They're really excellent. I'm sure you recognize a lot of the names. I know I met David Blevins. I don't know if he's here, but David Blevins is on the expert group. I'll also then talk about how to get involved. If you're interested in getting involved, if you hear something you don't like, if you have an idea that you want to contribute, I'll let you know how to do that. And finally, we'll have time for questions. So, motivations. Last summer, there was a survey that was sent out to those who were in the EE community, a survey that asked, what do you want to see in EE8? And the people who basically the EE platform at JSR took this very seriously and compiled all the results from the survey. The survey had 4,500 respondents, and the survey kind of came down to this pie chart. Last summer when they were talking about JSRs they wanted to put in for EE8, this pie chart came up a lot. And one thing you'll notice is that security takes up about a fifth of the pie chart. Security, nobody really has updated security since maybe like 1.4, EE 1.4. And so there's a lot of work, especially with simplifying security, because it's pretty difficult right now, and also with security interceptors. And by security interceptors, really, I think it's more of a general topic of updating the interface, making it, be CDI aware and maybe expression language aware. The community itself, when you go and look around at the different blogs, you'll find a lot of quotes that kind of reflect the same thoughts. Arjan Times, who's one of my favorite bloggers, says that the ultimate goal is to have basic security working without the need for any kind of vendor-specific configuration, deployment descriptors, or whatever. Reza Rahman is another blogger I read. He's quoted as saying, the EE security model is problematic in a cloud and PaaS environment where developers do not necessarily have easy access to non-standard vendor runtime features, and a self-contained application is much easier to manage. So generally, what's wrong with EE security, Java EE security, is that, and I'm talking about the Java EE standard security, is that it's viewed as not portable, it's abstract, it's confusing, it's antiquated. It was built in a day when the sysops and the server were supposed to take care of security for you, and applications were just sort of just, supposed to be plugged in and that's it. That's sort of changed now. Now that we have this cloud app developer paradigm, we have to have we don't want to really have the application server take care of all that configuration for you. We want to allow the application itself to be able to configure some of that security. And then generally speaking, with all of that going on, we're losing value. Generally, EE itself is losing value because when you want to set up security for your app, you just go and use like Shiro or Spring Security or PicketLink or whatever, some third-party framework, and then you'll never come back to EE security after that probably. So what we're doing in this JSR is pretty much trying to plug the portability holes. We're trying to modernize it by introducing CDI and expression language in different locations that make sense, mostly in areas of access control. And we're trying to make it generally more app developer friendly, where common security configurations are not required to be server changes, and where annotations you can use annotation defaults instead of requiring XML everywhere. So now I'll talk about the actual JSR process itself. I'm a new JSR spec lead. It was all kind of new to me. I really didn't know what was involved in terms of the overall process, but it's a pretty long process. Last summer, pretty much, so with a JSR, you have to have a sponsor. Oracle is sponsoring this JSR. I had to first convince people at Oracle that this was necessary. So last summer, I had to make a lot of presentations to architects and managers and different executives over at Oracle to say, hey, look, we need a JSR for security. That started in August of last summer, August of last year. By December, eventually went through all that process, went through the JCP process, and by the end of December, actually, it was like the day before Christmas, it was approved by the JCP, which is the committee that says, thou shalt have a JSR. So after Christmas, we started putting together the expert group. The expert group, we kind of thought, what would be a good expert group? Well, with a JSR having to do with EE APIs, you want to have EE API experts. You want to have people who understand the API, not so much security, but API itself. So one group of people we wanted were EE API veterans, people who had many years of using EE, and generally also many years of using the security API. The second category we wanted of experts, we wanted to have third-party security framework developers, people like those who built Shiro, people who built Spring Security, people who built PicketLink. We want to have as many of these third-party providers on the expert group as possible because they've already solved the problems that we're trying to solve, and their input would be just really invaluable. And thirdly, we need to have the stakeholders of the EE platform security implementers, people like my group in WebLogic, IBM, and Red Hat. So in March, we started the expert group. It actually launched, and we actually started our discussions last March, a few months ago. The expert group, as I said, consists of 14 members. You might recognize some of these names. As I said, Tommy Tribes, David Blevins is on the group. We have Les Hazelwood from Stormpath. He's actually the guy who spearheaded Shiro. We have some individual members who are contributing. We have some Red Hat contributions. We have IBM, and we have also Argentine, who I just mentioned earlier, who does a lot of contributions to EE in general. So in the first month, we had a big explosion of activity. It was really kind of amazing because it was like we woke up this monster, right? Because a lot of people had years and years of complaints about EE security, about how it does all these bad things and how we really had to fix it up, and everybody had like a million ideas. And there was lots of brainstorming going on. There was 237 messages on the expert group mailing list in the first month. So, imagine waking up in the morning and seeing 50 messages on your email list and just having to go through them all. And they're all deep. You have to really investigate each one because everybody has a good idea. We have a GitHub playground, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and we have examples and proposals in there. And there were 81 commits in the first month. And then already in the first month, we had 24 JIRA issues that were presented. So again, a very active expert group. Going forward, our first deliverable will be an early draft review, Q4 2015. Generally, JSRs revolve around Java 1. So that's going to be, coincidentally, Java 1. So that our early draft review means our first cut at what the spec will look like. So if you want to really see what we're talking about, you can see at that cut. Our next milestone will be it says public review, which is really not just like the next draft for the spec, but for me, it's the RI beta, right? We have to actually get an RI beta out by that time, so we can actually get code out that people can try. Then eventually we get down to the end here, and you have the final release, which at this point has been pushed out a little bit to first half of 2017. It seems like a long ways away, but I'm sure it's going to come quicker than I can expect. Where at that point, we'll have to have the final spec, the reference implementation completed, and as well as the technology compatibility kit, which is the software that's sent out to the server implementers so that they can say, hey, if you pass this, then you're EE8 compliant. Okay. So next I'm going to go into some of the ideas that the expert group came up with. This is going to be the majority of the presentation. So the ideas are broken up into several categories. If you look at our website, you'll see these are actually epics. Terminology, authentication mechanism, identity store, password aliasing, role permission assignment, security context, and authorization interceptors. Now, are these the only things that need to be fixed in security? No. Is this going to make everybody happy? No. But we have a limited amount of time, and we're trying to really just attack the low-hanging fruit, things that we can do that will solve a lot, make things make life much easier for EE users without a lot of effort. And there's a lot of things that fall into that category. If you don't like looking at lists, here's another view of the same diagram where you can see dependencies, right? An authentication mechanism would depend on an identity store. The security context actually would be something that you can access different areas of your current security, and it would need access to the authentication mechanism and the identity store and the permissions. The authorization interceptors would need access to the this role permission assignment, and then password aliasing really doesn't have any dependencies. It's just sort of on the side. So terminology. Why start with terminology? When you build an API, there are lot of definitions. A lot of people have this different terms for the same thing. And this became really evident in the first day that we did when we started doing our expert group. Everybody had sort of the same names for this, different names for the same thing. And we realized also that the containers, different containers themselves, had different names for the same things. For instance, like, when something gets authenticated, is that something a user or a caller? If you look at the HTTP spec, it's called a user, as in get user principle. When you look at the EJB spec, it's a get caller. It's a caller, as in the get caller principle. What is a group? People think, oh, it's obviously a group of users. Well, some people will say that no, it's a permission. If you look at some platform implementations, people will say, oh, when I assign a group, I'm actually assigning a role, right? A little confusion there. And then this one is actually one that got kicked around for a while in our expert group. And what is that something where identities are stored, okay? Maybe you say, oh, it's obviously an identity store, but some people call it a security provider, a realm, a repository, a login module, an identity manager, an authenticator, an authentication provider, an identity provider, right? How do you narrow that down? How do you put that in a spec and make sure that you say this and say, I mean that? So the first thing in the spec will be a terminology. Okay, I'll talk about authentication mechanism. Now these are updates we want to do to the current authentication mechanism. So the use case here is that applications want to manage their own users and groups, right? You have an application that, say, some sort of shopping cart application, and you have a user that's going to register themselves. You want to be able to put that user and register it in a standard way and have it so that your application can use it without the server getting involved, because the server would have no idea what to do. So you want to be able to also authenticate those users to assign roles. You would want to maybe authenticate in a way that's domain specific, something the server would never understand. Maybe the server environment you're using doesn't support OpenID Connect or doesn't support some other Kerberos or some other specialized authentication mechanism you want, but you want to be able to plug in something in your app that your app can take advantage of, even though your server doesn't understand it, so you can use that in your app. And generally speaking, as in any standardization, you want to be able to have something that works in one platform development, one platform environment, and be portable across without having to worry about special libraries being available or different capabilities in the server platform. So current solutions. Proprietary server support, we all know that you can do that in like WebLogic or WebSphere or whatever. You certainly can use third-party security providers, Apache Shiro, Spring Security. They'll certainly provide you with ways of getting to your identities. And then there's this thing called JASPIC. Java Authentication Service Provider for Containers. Has anybody heard of JASPIC? Ah, all right. Great, all right. So JASPIC is this sort of obscure spec that came out in EE6. And it's basically JSR 196. It's currently in maintenance release 1.1. It was released recently. It is maintenance release in 2013. What it is actually a standardized, portable, thin, low-level authentication mechanism, which is probably why you haven't heard of it, because it's really kind of tough to use from an application standpoint. It's extensible from within an application, actually. It's available right now on app servers. It integrates with a container. Okay, so one of the biggest problems with different server implementations is their notion of a subject, the authenticated user, is represented differently in each container. JASPIC gets around that by having a standardized way of telling the container, hey, I've got a user, I've got groups, you build your subject any way you like, and I don't care. And that's already built and already defined. And it also will implement most authentication methods. I'm not sure exactly what it doesn't implement, but I know that I talked to this spec lead recently, and he said there's a couple of obscure things that it won't cover, but it covers like 99% of the authentication methods out there. At the heart of JASPIC is this thing called a server AuthModule. And it's really simple. It's 5 methods. And it does things that you expect, right? It'll initialize, it'll validate a request, it'll give you some metadata about what it supports, it'll secure a response, and then it gives you the ability to clean up when you're done. Simple. So now you think, why haven't I ever heard of this? Why have only 2 people who happen to be involved heavily in EE know about this stuff? And the reason why is this. To use JASPIC in an application, you have to define 6 classes. You have to create a servlet context listener, an auth config factory, an auth config provider, a server auth config object, a server auth context object, and eventually create a server auth module. 6 classes. There's no way around it within the application to do that. Now, if you're using a server implementation and you want to make something that's not portable, you can certainly, in most servers, be able to provide a server itself, like let's say with WebLogic or with JBoss, Glassfish. You can definitely say, I have a server auth module, use this. And you can, through the UI, through the admin console, through scripting, you can certainly do it, but that's not a portable solution, and that will apply to the entire server, not just your application. It won't go with your deployment. This is what I'm saying here is that you can actually define this within your application. So our first simplification that we're proposing is we take this down to 1 method. What we're going to do is we're going to define a standardized helper for JASPIC, build it on top of JASPIC, where instead of having to define these 3 methods, we just have one class you've got to create, and it would be just an implementation of a servlet context listener and a helper that will let you just basically do all the other work for you. The way that would look is, here's a sample servlet context listener. We'd have a class, maybe it's called JASPIC. Again, we're just a spec at this point. And it would have a method called register server auth module. And you would provide a server auth module instance and a context. You just pass along the servlet context. And this would automatically do the registration for you. Basically, it does the same 6 steps, except it's all built in, and you can do it in just 1 line. We could extend that by supporting an annotation. So we could standardize an annotation so that you could actually say at Authenticator, you pass in the server auth module class in the Authenticator, and then it would apply for that, whatever it is, I guess the servlet in this case, when you want to do authentication. Now, if you have written server auth modules, you know that you might want to provide parameters for that. This is not a complete representation of what the annotation would look like. There'll probably be other additional parameters for options that you'd had in there too. So again, 6 methods that you had to hard code. Now you're talking either 1 method, or 1 class, I should say, 6 classes you had to hard code. Now you're down to 1 class or 1 annotation, right? And maybe now people will start using this thing. When you look within the actual server auth module implementation, here's one that might do basic auth. There are still 5 methods. I said there are only 5 methods, but there's still 5 methods. Wouldn't it be cool if you could just make it easier? Still. Well, if you assume a certain profile, okay, like if you assume an HTTP servlet profile, which most people are using, you can actually dumb this down to even less methods. And so, for instance, it can actually be just 1 method, validate HTTP request. Because what could happen is we could standardize an HTTP server auth module, which would be an abstract class. And we could say that, once you say that you're using things within HTTP, all the other methods kind of drop out to be defaults. You kind of do the same thing in all those methods in HTTP, and you kind of come down to just 1 method, which is validate this request. Additionally, if you were familiar with JASPIC, you would know that the messaging coming in, the parameters coming in into this method are just object. You always have to cast. Like people who do JASPIC know that there's always casting. They don't want to do this. Another advantage of having a base class like this is that we would do all the casting for you in the base class, and then you just get in your validate HTTP request, you get a request and response. Hey, makes sense, right? You get that information right there, and you can use that directly without having to mess around. And now let's say we expand that 1 method again, okay? Validate HTTP request for a basic authenticator. You still have a bunch of code. If you're using JASPIC, as I mentioned earlier, there's a place where you have to write callbacks. You have to actually, in order to populate the subject when you're done, you have to actually write these callbacks, which are classes where you inject, or actually just place in the callback the username or the groups, and then you have to call the handler to say, hey container, take this username and groups. And that can end up being 10 lines of code. And we're going to simplify that also in this base class by having it so that you'd have 1 method that's appropriate for the particular profile. In this case, just notify container about login. It would have the username and the groups as parameters, and it would do all that callback work for you behind the scenes. You can narrow it down to 1 line of code instead of 10. which opens up the possibility of having modules of authentication modules. One idea that came up with, that the expert group came up with, is having a few standardized authenticators, maybe an OpenID Connect standard server auth module that we could standardize. This is actually an early idea. I don't know if we're going to get that far because there's a lot of other ideas that we might want to do that would take less effort and have more bang for buck. But this certainly opens up the community to do this. And in fact, I know of at least one implementation of an OpenID Connect server auth module, some brave soul who's done it the old way, and you can take advantage of that right away. Finally, in authentication, we have events that we want to standardize. Okay, so these would be standard CDI events that you could observe, and these would be sent in certain areas, certain key points in the authentication process by the container. A pre-authenticate event, a post-authenticate event, pre-login event, pre-logout event, post-logout event. And what you could use these events for is to track the number of login users, for example. Maybe you want to track failed login attempts. Maybe you want to have a side effect of, if you had a remote login authentication, you want to create a user that's local that would mimic the one that's out remotely. Perhaps you want to load application-specific user preferences based on a login event. So this gives you some possibilities on interacting with the authentication mechanism, and reacting in some way your app might want. Next, I'm going to talk about the identity store. So the identity store. Again, this is the case where the application would be managing their own users and groups. Okay, you need access to repositories of identities, like users. This is typically the case of where your app has a database or an LDAP someplace with all your users, and you want to be able to access those users in a standard way in your authentication. And again, you want to do this without having any type of server configuration, any type of server specific configuration. This actually was a specific question on the survey, that EE8 survey I mentioned earlier. The question was, should we standardize on requirements for simple security providers and their configuration? Simple security providers is one of those synonyms for identity store, and 65% say yes. So currently, solutions for this, as I mentioned, there's no standardized EE support. Everything's all done by the server implementations. And of course, there are third-party frameworks that provide user and group APIs. So what we could simply define is something like this, where you could go and have an identity store mechanism that would pull users and groups and roles actually from a database or a file or an LDAP. And then would provide the authenticator, which we mentioned earlier, the server auth module, with a caller and with roles, and be able to also, since you have the information, be able to also handle credential validation. Oh, and also we're going to also define a customized way. In case you have other stores of users, you don't have to actually go with these three we defined. We'll provide an API an SPI that you can extend it. So an identity store would be an interface that would look like this. You would be able to use it to validate. It's basically a read-only thing. You would be able to validate credentials with it. So you give it credentials, you give it login ID, password. It'll give you the results based on what's in your currently pointed identity store. It would understand how to interpret those credentials, too, in a way that wouldn't expose that interpretation to your application. And then it's got standard getters. They're actually a little bit more than getters. They're more like built-in queries. They let you get callers. You can get the callers that are in your group. You can get what callers are in a role. You can do regular expressions against callers and do the same for groups, and then also query for roles. Now, this is not in your current context. This is really just querying out to your database or your LDAP to get the information, but you can get that information in a standardized way. Now, when I say caller, I'm talking about user. Again, the terminology thing, I already got zinged on our expert group when I sent out the proposal for the identity store about how, well, we haven't defined if we're talking about caller or user yet. You can't use caller yet. So you get the idea. We're still kind of thinking about that. And as for credentials, well, credentials being username, password, could be a token, could be an X509 certificate, could be whatever you decide, maybe a JOT. The system we're proposing is that we'd have an interface that would just have the ability to just that just have defined the ability to clear itself, and then you would create subclasses of that credential interface for different types. Now, we would come with some built-in types that were commonly used, but you could extend that to be whatever credential type you want. And what would happen is, if you were to create some custom type, there's a corresponding credential handler that we would define also in the SPI that's mapped to that type, that would understand how to interpret the type, how to retrieve it from the store, and how to do the authentication. And this is how you'd use it. You'd inject the identity store that's currently in your context. You would say you want to validate some credentials, so you would just say validate credentials. You pass in the username, password. Then with the result, you would just say, is it valid? If it's valid, you can just pull the roles out, and then you can apply the roles to the container, maybe through a JASPIC callback. I'm not going to go through all this, but this is basically the mechanism behind the credential work. What will happen is, I guess the gist here is just that, for the identity store, the credentials will come in. It'll be assigned a credential handler, which will understand how to deal with passwords, password credentials, whatever particular style of credentials you have. It would know to go to the store to get the caller. It would know how to retrieve the credentials. It would know how to interpret the credentials that you get back and make sense of how to use them correctly to validate the user. I guess the takeaway here is that there's an SPI that would allow you to extend and define the credentials, how the credentials are stored, actually the different types of identity stores, and also how the credentials are interpreted. One other idea was kicked around with Identity Store, and I don't know exactly how this is really going to be something we're going to continue with, because I've heard some bad feedback about this, but the ability to have it so that we can actually define it as an annotation. So you define an identity store by just defining an annotation with a GINDI name, the URL where you're pointing to, with LDAP in this case, and some credentials, and maybe have an assume schema or have the ability to define a schema, and then you would just at resource it to a particular identity store. This would be an alternative way of configuring it. And then I got a lot of slack about this one too. This is another way we could do is actually have embedded identity store, where you actually have it so that you'd name it in line. Now the reason why this looks, of course you don't want to have passwords in your code, but this is a case where maybe if you want to have just quickly in a development environment, come up with a user, an identity store that you can use right then and there without having to configure anything that's too difficult. All right, password aliasing. This is when an application uses typically an application uses passwords to access resources like an LDAP or a database. These passwords are typically stored in annotations or deployment descriptors, and basically the best practice, obviously, is you don't want to have clear text passwords in your code or in your config. And this is going to be we're defining a portable way to protect stored passwords. This was a feature that was deferred out of EE7 because of time constraints. It was actually a question on the survey, and about 58% of the people that were surveyed said that they would like to see this feature. Wrong way. Okay. Currently, there's no Java EE support for this. Glassfish happens to have password aliasing support, and third-party security providers definitely have ways of hiding your passwords. They usually use an embedded encryption scheme where you pass in how you want to hash it or whatever algorithm or salt you want to use, and they'll take care of it for you that way. So the idea is that we would define a password aliasing syntax where you could take this sort of an EL-looking expression and place it inside of either your annotation or your deployment descriptor, and the container would interpret it in the last minute, right before it's being needed, and be able to use it. So the process would look something like this, where the expression would be resolved just at the last minute when it's needed. It would become whatever the password is. It would be applied, and then it would be cleaned up. And passwords would reside in a password alias archive. And this would be something typically like it wouldn't be a JKS file necessarily, maybe some PKCS12 formatted file, something like that. But it would sit like any other resource in your application, and it would be deployed with your application. So generally, again, this is for annotations and deployment descriptors. we would standardize a secure credentials archive for bundling the alias and the actual password values with applications. The platform would then consume those credentials, that credential archive upon deployment. And the way you manipulate that credential store is the way you sort of manipulate JKS files. You'd have there'd probably be a key tool update that would be able to read this sort of file and allow you to change and update the credentials. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the role permission assignment API. This is, again, a recurring theme. Application manages its own users and groups. As you can tell, EE, when it was originally designed, was not really built to have applications do their own users and groups. Everything was delegated off to the server, and these are problems we're trying to address with this JSR. Applications, they need to assign roles to their users and groups based on some application-specific model. These users may be stored in an app-specific directory, and again, you want to do all this without changing anything in the server, nothing server-specific, just portable. This again was a question that came up in the survey. Should we standardize group to role mapping? Right? 70% just about said yes, and this has been a big pain point from a lot of app developers, from what I understand. Oops. Currently, there's no standardized Java EE support for this sort of mapping. There's only proprietary server support by design, right? Originally, EE was meant to be so that we take an application and you deploy it. The app sysop or whoever, the app administrator, the server administrator would do that mapping for you. Only proprietary server support for this. And of course, third-party security providers, they'll let you do whatever you want to do with roles and authorities and permissions. The simplest way to do the standardized role mapping is to define it in, let's say, WebXML, right? Provide a way so that you have a security role map element, and then be able to map a group and a role in a way that's portable, not in the, let's say, WebLogic XML or Glassfish XML. Another feature that came up in the discussions is the idea to standardize one-to-one group-to-role mapping. This is something that some deployments do, some implementations do automatically, like I think JBoss does and Glassfish does, where when you define a group, it automatically becomes the role name. What typically happens in a lot of app servers is that you have to, you have a role and a name that have to be, so you have a role and a group, and they both have the same name, like manager, admin, whatever. And it's just a tedious job to go and try to define multiple instances of the same name, mapping groups to roles. And if you have a one-to-one role mapping defined as a standard, you can say, hey, turn this on, and I'll just define the groups, and that'll become the roles, and you can bypass role mapping. Another idea that came up in the expert group is having an embedded role mapper. Again, I think this would be more like a thing where you, for development, you could actually just specify role maps right there in your code as an annotation. And then there's this concept of dynamic role mapping. Now what this kind of addresses is the idea that, say you have an app and you have a lot of basic users or a lot of standard users, and you want to give them, premium access. You want to kind of upgrade them, right? So what you want to do is have a way to take your user and apply better roles, bigger roles, more advanced roles, and do this dynamically and have your app be able to take it in, right? Currently, EE, there's no way of doing this. And what we're standardizing is the idea that, I think what you currently would do is you'd go out to the database, you'd update your database with the new roles, and take that in. Where we're going to, through our identity store standard, we're thinking of having so that you update your database, and then from that point on, your authenticator, whether it be JASPIC, and that's using the identity store, will be able to then read that information back and be able to take advantage of it. And since the mechanism is already in place to place that into the enabled to have the container consume that, then at that point it will be consumed by the container, and then your role, at roles allowed and various things that you have already available in your servlet container will automatically take advantage of that. This is just a slide that shows you how to actually read your identity store if you want to find out whether or not a group is in a role, or whether or not, again, roles have groups, and whether or not groups whether or not a user has a role. So this is all just an example of that. Not really much here. So next we're going to talk about the concept of a security context. This has actually come up as being a pretty popular topic. What this has to do with is, well, here's the use case. The use case is that an application needs access to a common security API regardless of where they are. You want to be able to do the same kind of security work whether you're in a servlet container or an EJB container or a CDI bean. You want to be able to log in a user and be able to see whether or not the current authenticated user has certain rights. This use case is that an application would need to have standard access to a security API to various things like run as. And also, an application would want to have, oh yeah, I already said that, regardless of which container you're in, so whether or not you're in a server container or EJB container, you want to still be able to access this current security context using the same API. Currently, there's no support for this in Java. This is something that third-party security providers do provide by default, because when you have a third-party library, you need to have access to some central context in order to figure out, what is the current context. So you get that for free, sort of, in the third-party security framework. So what I'm talking about, if you haven't followed me yet, is that, like for instance, in an EJB, if you want to find out if a caller is in a role, you have to get the session context and call is caller in role and find out if that's true. So you have to use the session context. In a servlet, to do exactly the same thing, you have to get the request and say, is user enroll with again, admin in this case. So again, you have to, in this case, in a servlet, you have to use an HTTP servlet request and know that that's what you have to use. In a CDI bean, you can't do anything. There's no such thing as that, this sort of context, security context in a CDI bean. In JAX-RS, there is a security context. It's defined within JAX-RS, and it will, again, it has the same sort of functionality where you can ask, in this case, again, in this example, is a user enroll, and be able to do certain security context operations. It says security context, but this only works within JAX-RS. So what we propose on defining is a standard like this: one security context interface that lets you do all these things. Be able to get the current authenticated user, find out if the current authenticated user is in a certain role, get all the roles that are for the specific current authenticated user. Do we have an authenticated user? Is the user in any one of these list of roles? Invoke a login right now, right? Invoke a login from anywhere you are. Log out and be able to run as a certain role. So the idea here is that for managed beans, whether CDI beans, servlet, EJB, JAX-RS, anywhere across any container, that you could do something like this. You could just say, at inject security context, and then call a method called is user enroll, or whatever operation you want to do, and use that same method regardless of which container you're in, and have it always be available. The last area I want to discuss is the authorization interceptors proposals. So this is where an application needs to restrict specific methods to authorize users. So we're talking about method authorization. There might be application model rules that are used to make access decisions. In other words, not just roles, but actually have complex rules based on your application's business models, where role is not really sufficient. There were specific questions about this in the survey. One question was, should we consider adding security interceptors in Java EE8? Well, 79% say yes. And then, should we simplify authorization by introducing an EL-based authorization annotation? And 67% say yes. So there's a very big need, big desire in the community to have something like this. Currently, E-authorization has no rule-based authorization. It's only role-based. However, third-party providers third-party security frameworks do provide role and permission and rule-based APIs. So here's one example of a proposal we had. This would be using expression language authorization rules. And this would be where you'd be able to use an expression language rule to gain access, that would let you have access to the security context and access to the invocation context to build an expression language rule that would let you gate your access. So in this case, we'd have, say, an @evaluate secured, which would take in the EL. The expression language would have access to different beans, and you can create a rule. In this example, we're accessing the security context and seeing whether or not the current authenticated user has the manager role. And then we have a schedule bean, which knows the current working schedule of the company that you're working in, and says, okay, is it office hour? Is it now is it office hours? So the manager can only transfer funds if it's currently during working hours. Now, you can see a problem here is that you're going to start putting text rules all over your app, and you may not want to do that. So an extension of this is being able to centrally manage this, maybe in a repository, like an LDAP repository. So perhaps we define an LDAP authorization rules annotation, which allow you, and schema behind it, that would allow you to define an LDAP repository location to put these rules in, and then you could redo that last authorization rule as being having a reference to the authorization repository with a rule key, like this. So in this case, again, the rule will be transfer funds, and it would have the same result. An alternative to this is something you might have seen in other frameworks, is an access decision voter, which does basically the same thing except in a class, not in an expression language. It's a user-defined class for making access decisions. In this case, in this example, you'll see that there's an account access decision voter class being specified with the @secured annotation, and within there would be logic that would check to see whether or not the current context has permission to do that access. And the way that would look is we'd standardize an access decision voter interface, and then it would have one method, check permission. And in that check permission method, you'd gain access to the current context and also have the ability to send back violations to say, hey, don't allow this access, and this is the reason why. So in this case, you can see that the process is occurring. It's checking for violations based on the current method being called, and then if it found a violation and sent back a security violation, said, no, you can't get in. Because there's a violation being sent, access would not be allowed. Okay, so those are kind of the wrap of ideas. There are a lot of other ideas. This is sort of a sampling. But we have to sort of, be able to find what's really important and do it, because time is a really valuable resource in terms of how much we have with this expert group. We're trying to get as much as we can get done within a certain amount of time, and we're trying to hit all the high points, all the important points. If you're interested in getting involved, we have a project page. The project page is a java.net page. It's a starting point for all of our resources. From the starting page, you can go to our GitHub repo. You can go to our Jira page. You can go to, we have a Google Doc public folder where we keep things like, for instance, the security, the identity store. There's a proposal in there, like 14-page proposal about that. What I'm trying to do as a spec lead is I'm trying to, okay, so most of the communication goes on on a mailing list, right? And there's a lot of spurious ideas. So what I'm trying to do is, as we move toward a consensus, kind of like lay out all the ideas out on a Java doc, get comments from different people, from the expert group, and kind of build the spec from there so that I have a nice cohesive understanding of what it is that we're proposing. We have a users list. It's a basic Java.net users list. As a subscriber to the users list, anybody can subscribe. You get all the email from the expert group, and you can post messages there, and expert group members will respond. And finally, we have a GitHub playground. This is open to anybody to submit. We actually have, I showed the proposals, we actually have a proposals and an examples repository, 2 repositories. Proposals are like, hey, I got an idea. Here it is. Here's some sample code, And what's really cool about GitHub, of course, is you can put the README that explains your proposal, and you can tell us why you think it's important, and what it solves, and why it's important, and how it will be very useful. We also have an examples repository where you can put in examples of, say, hey, this sucks. Can you fix this problem? Here's an example of something that doesn't work. Or maybe have a reference reference from your proposal into the examples, saying, hey, here's an example of how this may fix a problem. Okay, that's it. That's all I got. So I hope that you like what you heard. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, one question.
Okay.
So that's going to come out in EE8. And,
yes.
It was about time.
Okay.
What about the long-term plans? Are we going to dump are we going to prune servlet stuff? JASPIC, it would be good to say from EE9 onwards, in servlets, if you don't use the servlet context anymore, these have been pruned or something like that.
Right.
Do you see it moving forward?
Yeah, actually, so we don't want to make anything too disruptive. Like we're basically, at this point, we just want to add capabilities, right? Because we don't want to break any apps or anything like that. So we're adding capabilities, like that security context stuff. It's not going to pull, we're not going to stop you from logging in from a servlet, right? We're just going to add this capability. In fact, the proposal is really just to kind of call in, have the spec say, call into servlet to do it or whatever, right? But yeah, the idea is definitely, let's come up in the expert group. The first phase is to get out the, fix the bad things right away that we can do. And a lot of these things are not that hard. A lot of like the JASPIC simplifications, this is like, there's nothing to it. It's just a matter of specifying it. But definitely moving forward, we want to pull all those different aspects of security into, standardize it into like one platform security spec. So yeah, and there's plenty of things. I mean, as I said, this is really just touching the really critical problems that we found. There's a lot more to it. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff about cross-site scripting. There's like, a lot of other architectures that people have brought up, like, why don't you have out-of-the-box support for various authentication mechanisms. This sort of like opens the door. I think we haven't really had a spec for security that's been a broad spec. We've had a lot of deep specs like JASPIC, JASPIC that have been like geared toward one particular thing. But there hasn't been really a broad spec that goes across the platform. So we're trying to go, wide and shallow and trying to get all the problems we can in a sweep as opposed to really going too deep. So that's the kind of a theme you're seeing here, that we're just kind of defining a few interfaces and some basic simplifications that we can come up with, just so that when you go and deploy your app to EE, it'll just be there, right? And again, these are all like a lot of easy things that we can get done pretty easily, and once it's done, it's going to help a lot. We have a lot of people on the expert group who've had a lot of pain with some of these pain points, and I said, I can't believe EE is taking so long to do these kind of things. So that's been very helpful. Any other questions? Oh, yep.
In the identity storage
yep.
and the credentials tab, you talked about how to identify the type of credential it was.
Right.
Oh.
It's simpler than that. What happens is we just do it by type, by class matching. We have the current proposal says that we'd have we'd have a registry of credential handlers, and we'd say when you register, we'd say, okay, what credential types do you support? I support the the username password credential. I support the just password credential. Whatever it happens to understand. So when it comes in, when we have that identity store process, it'll just basically do a lookup and say, okay, I got a credential of this class. Who can service this? And it'll just do a lookup in a map and pull back the credential handler and just use that. It's actually a little bit. It's also tied. It actually goes to this. I don't know if you noticed it, but it goes to the store and asks the store where the credential handler, which credential handler to use, because certain stores can only handle certain types of credentials. We found. So, and this is actually based on things like looking at how Picket Link works. There's a lot of history in terms of current existing identity store mechanisms like IDM mechanisms. So we're not trying to invent anything from scratch here. This is really standardization, and we learned from some of the existing implementations that we really have to tie it to store and make sure that we come off a store to say, yes, indeed, LDAP can't support this, but database can. So we're gonna tie it that way.
But I mean, sometimes I want to provide different means of authorization, but when I get the authorization, I'm not sure what it was. It might have been a yacht or an auto token or certificate. I have to know that before.
Well. Okay, the identity store mechanism would be like, you've already pulled the credentials out from wherever, right? Login form, identity assertion, maybe you got it back from some interaction with Google or something, and you have to know, like that part, the identity store won't solve. You have to know basically what it is you're holding, and then at that point you have to build that credential, or maybe you can use the built-in credential types, and then pack it in there so that the credential store can understand that. I mean, it's not going to be that smart that it's going to be able to interpret it and be able to understand, oh, this looks like a token. This looks like a X509 certificate. I think I'll just take the CN from it or something. It's not going to know that. You could build something that would, like, if you passed in an X509 certificate credential and you'd have a handle that mapped to it, it would know to look into it and do that, but you'd have to build that. And we might come out of the box with something like that. Like, no, out of the box. It's a spec. I might specify something like that. I think like 2 or 3 of the more common ones we're going to specify. We'll look at what the implementations do now. Like, obviously, username, password, probably something based on JOT, some JOT-based token that's pretty useful. Maybe X509. Well, I know that those 2 have come up a couple of times in the group. So, okay, I have 1 minute left. Okay, well, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your time, and have a safe trip home. All right. So, all right, thank you.